Hey, welcome back. Today, we're jumping into one of the absolute biggest questions you can ask. Is it possible to build a logical framework for understanding God? We're going to walk through a system that tries to do just that, building a bridge from human reason all the way to divine revelation. So, let's dive right in. And we've got to start with the core problem, right? The question that really frames this whole thing. If God is infinite, how can our little finite human minds ever hope to truly grasp that? It's a huge puzzle. And honestly, it's one that people have been wrestling with for thousands of years. Okay, so first things first. The foundational rule in this entire system is that you have to start with God. The thinking goes like this. If you want to understand anything else, humanity, the universe, reality itself, you have to begin with a solid concept of the one who is said to be the source of it all. And this idea is perfectly captured in a verse from the book of Romans. It basically positions God as the origin story, the thing that keeps it all running, and the ultimate goal of, well, everything. So in this way of thinking, God isn't just another topic on the list. God is the starting line for every single topic. Think of it like a pyramid. The whole base, the massive foundation, has to be your understanding of God. Because if that foundation is shaky or wrong, then everything you try to build on top of it, your ideas about people, about purpose, about reality, it's all going to be unstable. It all rests on that first block. So if we're supposed to start there, the obvious next question is how? How do we get any knowledge about a divine being in the first place? Well, this framework suggests that there are two very different paths we can take. And here are those two paths. On one side, you've got what's called innate knowledge. This is the idea that there's an instinct, almost like a built-in hunch, that there's something more out there. And then on the other side, you have acquired knowledge. This is everything you learn the old-fashioned way, by observing, by using your reason, and by studying. Now, here's a really key distinction. This system says no to pure agnosticism. That's the idea that we can't know anything at all. But it accepts something called incomprehensibility. That's the idea that, yeah, we can know some things, but our finite human brains can never, ever know an infinite God perfectly or completely. There's always going to be more. All right, so if knowledge is at least possible, what's the next step? Well, people have tried to build a rational case for it, and that brings us to our next section. We're going to look at 6 classic arguments that try to prove God exists using nothing but logic and what we see around us. So here's our roadmap for this section. We've got 5 famous philosophical arguments that really lean on human reason. And then there's a 6th one that, well, it starts from a totally different place. Let's dig into a couple of the most well-known philosophical ones first. First up, the cosmological argument. This one is all about cause and effect. Just look around. Everything that happens has a cause, right? A ball doesn't just start flying on its own. Someone had to throw it. A forest doesn't just appear. It grew from seeds. So if you just keep asking, well, what caused that? And you trace that chain of cause and effect backward and backward and backward, you can't do that forever. This argument says that logic just demands that there had to be an initial uncaused cause that kicked off the whole chain reaction of the universe. And that first domino, the argument concludes, is God. Okay, now let's switch gears to a totally different kind of argument. This famous analogy gets us into the teleological argument. It's not about what started it all, it's about design. So picture this. You're walking on a deserted beach, and you find a watch ticking away in the sand. You'd never think, oh, the wind and the waves must have made this. No way, you'd know instantly that it had a make. This argument just applies that exact same logic to the universe itself. It looks at the mind-boggling complexity of a human cell or the perfect laws of physics that keep planets in orbit, and it says, just like that watch, this level of intricate order and function screams that there was an intelligent designer behind it all. And the other philosophical arguments are pretty fascinating too. The ontological one is probably the most abstract. It basically says that the very idea of a perfect being logically requires that being to actually exist. Then there's the moral argument, which looks at our deep universal sense of right and wrong and argues that it must point to a divine lawgiver. And finally, the ethnological argument, which just points out that every human culture in history has developed some form of religion, which suggests that impulse comes from a common, real source. Okay, this right here is super important because it shows a fundamental shift in logic. Those first 5 arguments we talked about, they're all inductive. They start with what we can see, the world, morality, ideas, and they try to reason up to God. But that 6th one, the biblical argument, it's deductive. It starts with this statement, God exists, like in Genesis 1:1, and reasons down from there.
It's a total flip from seeking proof to starting with faith.
And that leads us perfectly into our final section. Because, according to this framework, those logical arguments can only really take you so far. Sure, they might point to a first cause or a grand designer, but they can't tell you a single thing about what that being is actually like. For that, you have to move from general observation to what's called special revelation. So, after going through our gut feelings and all the rational proofs, this framework says there's one final source we need to turn to. It concludes that the most specific, detailed understanding of God's actual nature comes from what it considers to be direct revelation. In other words, the scriptures. And when this framework looks at the Bible, it says that God's essential nature can be boiled down to 3 core attributes. And these aren't just personality traits like being kind or angry. These are meant to describe the very fabric of God's being. So let's break them down real quick. First up, spirituality. The idea here is that God is pure spirit, not made of atoms or matter or anything physical. And the implication of that is huge. It means God can be both transcendent, that is, totally separate from and outside our universe, and at the exact same time be immanent, meaning fully present everywhere within it. Second, we have perfection. Now, this means God is seen as totally unique, absolutely complete, and, this is a big one, unchanging. So unlike the gods of, say, Greek mythology, who have flaws and evolve and fight with each other, the God in this framework is eternally consistent and needs nothing. This is what's said to set God completely apart from everything else in existence. And finally, we have simplicity. Okay, this one sounds easy, but it's a really deep philosophical idea. It doesn't mean simple, like easy to understand. It means God isn't made up of different parts. You know, a car is made of an engine and wheels and seats. This view says God has no parts. God doesn't have love as a quality. God is love. God doesn't have power. God is power. It describes a being that is a totally unified, indivisible whole. And that journey pretty much brings us to the end. We've gone from a gut feeling inside us all the way through the tough roads of logical arguments and ended up at the very specific claims of revelation. It leaves us with a much bigger question to chew on, though. In this big human search for answers, how do we make space for both of these powerful tools, logic and faith? What role does each one play in our own search for what's true?